You're standing in the Alcazar of Madrid in 1665, watching a 9-year-old girl take her first communion. The cathedral air is thick with incense and an unmistakable tension that seems to hang over every royal ceremony. The child kneeling at the altar is Margarita Teresa of Spain, and though the courtiers whisper about her ethereal beauty, you notice what the official portraits carefully avoid showing. Her jaw extends forward in an unusual way, creating a pronounced underbite that affects her speech and makes simple conversations difficult. When she stands to receive communion, her movements seem uncertain, as if her own body struggles with basic coordination. The priests offer prayers for her health and future, but there's an underlying concern in their voices, because this child, like so many Habsburg daughters before her, carries within her DNA the accumulated consequences of centuries of marriages between close relatives. What you are witnessing is not the result of chance or misfortune, but the systematic outcome of generations of calculated political marriages that transformed royal daughters into subjects of an unintentional genetic experiment. The girl at the altar will pass away within 8 years, her body unable to overcome the cascading health challenges built into her very genetic code by centuries of cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, and a dynasty so focused on maintaining bloodline purity that they created an increasingly narrow gene pool. By the time the 16th century reached its peak, royal daughters across Europe were experiencing mortality rates that would alarm modern medical professionals. Among the Spanish Habsburgs alone, 50% of children born between 1527 and 1661 passed away before their 10th birthday, compared to just 20% among Spanish commoners who lived without royal privileges or medical care. These were not losses due to warfare or accidents, but the result of bodies compromised by inherited genetic conditions that made survival increasingly difficult. The statistics are documented in church records, preserved in court documents, and recorded in the careful notes of physicians who witnessed patterns they couldn't fully understand. Before diving into these remarkable stories of dynastic politics and their unintended consequences, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history that don't always make it into textbooks, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these historical stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the complexities of the past. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty began in 1516 when Philip the Fair married Joanna of Castile, a union that appeared politically brilliant but carried unexpected genetic consequences. What contemporary chronicles described as Joanna's melancholic disposition was likely severe mental health challenges that may have been influenced by the neurological effects of limited genetic diversity. Joanna's own parents, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, were second cousins. Philip's family tree showed similar patterns of intermarriage, creating a genetic foundation that modern scientists can now analyze with remarkable precision. When their children married their own cousins and produced the next generation of Habsburg rulers, the inbreeding coefficient began climbing toward levels that would create significant health challenges. The mathematics of genetic inheritance reveal a troubling pattern. Every human being receives 2 copies of each gene, one from each parent. When parents share recent common ancestors, the likelihood increases substantially that their children will inherit 2 identical copies of the same genes, including those that carry genetic variants associated with health problems. Philip I, the founder of the Spanish Habsburg line, had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.025, meaning roughly 2.5% of his genetic material consisted of identical gene pairs inherited from shared ancestors. By the time Charles II was born in 1661, his inbreeding coefficient had reached 0.254, meaning more than 25% of his genes were identical copies inherited from the same ancestral sources. To put this in perspective, Charles II's genetic similarity to himself was higher than what we typically see in the children of siblings. The first generation of Habsburg daughters experienced what court physicians carefully described as constitutional delicacy. These were not character flaws, but biological challenges that manifested as frequent illnesses, developmental delays, and shortened lifespans that were often attributed to divine will rather than genetic factors. Isabel of Portugal, who married her cousin Charles V in 1526, gave birth to 7 children but lost 4 to what modern medical analysis suggests were complications related to inherited blood disorders. Historical accounts describe Isabel experiencing frequent dizzy spells, unusual bruising, and difficult recoveries from childbirth that required extended periods of medical care. Court records indicate that her personal physician recommended regular bloodletting to restore balance, a treatment that likely worsened any existing clotting disorders inherited from her family's compressed genetic background. Isabel's medical challenges extended far beyond the delivery room. Palace records document episodes where she would experience sudden weakness, requiring immediate rest and medical attention. Her personal attendants were trained to recognize the signs of what they called the royal condition, a diplomatic term for the constellation of symptoms that affected Habsburg women. When Isabel became pregnant with her 5th child, court physicians expressed serious concerns about her ability to survive another difficult labor. The infant, a daughter, lived only 3 weeks before succumbing to what modern pediatric specialists would recognize as complications from inherited metabolic conditions. The Habsburg jaw, scientifically known as mandibular prognathism, became the dynasty's most recognizable genetic marker. This pronounced underbite, caused by variations in genes controlling facial bone development, became more prominent with each generation as the same genetic material was repeatedly passed down through royal marriages. But the jaw was merely the visible sign of much deeper genetic challenges. Modern analysis of Habsburg portraits by Spanish researchers has revealed a direct statistical correlation between the severity of jaw prominence and the degree of inbreeding, with some family members displaying facial characteristics so pronounced that they affected eating and speaking. Charles I of Spain, depicted in his official portraits with artistic courtesy, was described by Italian diplomat Antonio de Betis as having an elongated face and a mouth that falls open when he is not carefully controlling it. The skeletal variations extended far beyond facial features. Court records from Habsburg palaces contain detailed accounts of royal daughters who experienced severe spinal curvature, shortened limbs, and bone formations unusual enough to require specially tailored clothing and furniture. Maria Anna of Austria, daughter of Ferdinand II, was described by her personal physician as having bones that developed in unexpected directions, likely referring to the severe joint problems and bone irregularities that affect individuals with certain inherited connective tissue disorders. By age 20, she required assistance with walking and could not raise her arms above shoulder level due to bone formations that caused ongoing discomfort and restricted movement. The daughters faced additional challenges that surviving records hint at through careful medical terminology and diplomatic language. Anna of Austria, who married her uncle Philip II in 1570 when she was 17 years old, gave birth to 5 children in rapid succession while experiencing what court physicians described as recurring weakness and periodic fevers. Modern medical historians analyzing the symptoms recorded by her personal physicians believe Anna experienced severe complications during and after childbirth that likely indicated inherited bleeding disorders. She passed away at 30 years old after her final pregnancy, officially from sudden illness, but more likely from complications that her genetically compromised health could not overcome. Anna's reproductive history reveals the particular challenges faced by Habsburg daughters who survived to childbearing age. Court midwives documented that her first labor lasted more than 30 hours and resulted in such significant blood loss that she required weeks of recovery before she could resume normal activities. Her second pregnancy ended in a miscarriage at 7 months, with medical records describing the loss in terms that suggest serious developmental problems. Her third child, a son who would become Philip III, survived but displayed clear signs of the genetic challenges he had inherited. Court tutors noted that he did not speak his first words until age 4 and showed developmental delays that persisted throughout his childhood. Anna's fourth pregnancy nearly proved fatal when she developed what modern obstetricians would recognize as severe preeclampsia, characterized by seizures, kidney problems, and dangerous blood pressure changes that caused temporary vision loss. The medical treatments available to these women often complicated their inherited conditions through well-intentioned but misguided interventions. Royal physicians, educated in medieval theories about bodily balance and divine intervention, prescribed bloodletting for genetic anemia, mercury treatments for neurological disorders, and enforced pregnancies for women whose bodies were already struggling with genetic challenges. Maria Anna of Austria, who married Philip IV after his first wife passed away, was subjected to increasingly intensive fertility treatments as she struggled to produce healthy male heirs. Court records describe procedures involving heated instruments, herbal preparations that caused severe digestive distress, and enforced bed rest that lasted for months at a time. The mercury treatments deserve particular attention for their systematic application despite obvious negative effects. Royal physicians believed that mercury, applied both externally and internally, could purify compromised blood and restore fertility to Habsburg women who struggled to carry pregnancies to term. Maria Anna was required to consume mercury-enhanced wine daily during her attempts to conceive, causing symptoms that court records describe as trembling of the limbs, loosening of the teeth, and periods of confusion. Modern toxicologists analyzing these historical accounts recognize clear signs of mercury poisoning, including the neurological effects that manifested as personality changes, memory problems, and the mood variations that earned Maria Anna a reputation for unpredictable behavior. The mercury likely worsened her existing genetic predisposition to neurological problems while failing to address the underlying reproductive issues caused by inherited genetic variations. The Catholic Church, rather than discouraging these marriages, actively facilitated them through an elaborate system of papal dispensations that effectively transformed moral law into negotiable policy. Canon law explicitly prohibited marriages between close relatives, considering such unions contrary to church teaching. But the Vatican had developed a sophisticated bureaucracy for granting exemptions to noble families willing to pay substantial fees. Hundreds of dispensations were issued throughout the 16th century, each one carefully worded to sound like spiritual guidance, while essentially approving genetic practices that created increasingly narrow gene pools for political convenience. The papal archives contained dispensations for uncle-niece marriages, first-cousin unions, and even marriages between individuals related through multiple ancestral lines. The Vatican's dispensation system operated with remarkable efficiency and considerable profitability. Pope Alexander VI established a formal fee structure for marriage exemptions, with closer blood relationships commanding higher payments. First-cousin marriages required payment of 300 ducats, while uncle-niece unions demanded 600 ducats plus additional fees for expedited processing. The most expensive dispensations were reserved for marriages between individuals related through multiple family lines, such as double first cousins or individuals who shared both maternal and paternal ancestors. These complex genetic relationships, which created the highest risk for inherited disorders, commanded fees of up to 2,000 ducats, making them profitable enough that papal officials actively encouraged such unions among wealthy noble families. The system became so routine that requesting a dispensation was considered standard diplomatic protocol. When Philip II sought permission to marry his niece Anna of Austria, the papal chancellery processed the request alongside dozens of similar petitions from noble families across Europe. The dispensation granted to Philip and Anna explicitly acknowledged their blood relationship, while declaring that the unity of the Christian people and the stability of kingdoms justified overriding standard church law. The Vatican collected substantial revenue from these services, creating a financial incentive to approve even the most genetically problematic unions. Pope Julius III reportedly observed that divine providence works through many channels, including those that support the Church's mission. papal officials developed increasingly sophisticated theological justifications for approving marriages that violated fundamental church teachings about family relationships. Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, who oversaw marriage dispensations during the mid-16th century, wrote extensively about the divine purpose served by keeping royal bloodlines concentrated and pure. His theological treatises argued that Habsburg blood carried special divine favor that should not be diluted through marriage to commoners or foreign nobles. This reasoning provided religious cover for genetic practices that created increasingly severe inherited disorders while generating enormous revenue for the Vatican. Farnese personally accumulated considerable wealth through dispensation fees, using the funds to construct elaborate palaces and support artistic commissions that celebrated the Habsburg marriages he had helped authorize. By the late 16th century, the consequences of systematic inbreeding had created a medical crisis that court physicians struggled to understand or address effectively. Infant mortality among Spanish Habsburgs reached levels that shocked even contemporary observers accustomed to high childhood mortality rates. Of 34 children born to Spanish Habsburg kings between 1527 and 1661, 10 passed away before their first birthday and 17 before age 10. These were not losses due to plague or accidents, but the result of bodies that struggled to maintain basic biological functions. Court records describe newborns with severe breathing difficulties, children who never learned to walk properly, and adolescents who experienced sudden medical emergencies that proved fatal. The pattern of infant mortality reveals the mathematical progression of genetic challenges. Habsburg newborns experienced conditions that were virtually unknown among common Spanish families of the same period. Palace midwives documented infants born with hearts so malformed that they could not circulate blood effectively, lungs that failed to expand properly, and digestive systems that could not process nutrition normally. One particularly detailed medical record from 1598 describes the birth of Philip, the third sister, who survived only 6 days. The infant was born with what court physicians described as a heart divided against itself, likely referring to a severe septal defect that prevented proper circulation. Her skin remained blue throughout her brief life, and she passed away during what appears to have been cardiac failure caused by congenital defects. The daughters who survived childhood often faced even more serious challenges as they reached reproductive age. Margarita Theresa of Austria, daughter of Philip IV and his niece Mariana of Austria, was married to her uncle Leopold I of Austria when she was 15 years old. The genetic impression was so severe that Margarita Theresa and Leopold shared ancestors through both their mother's and father's lines, creating what geneticists call a double cousin relationship with inbreeding coefficients approaching those of siblings. Margarita Theresa gave birth to 4 children, but only one daughter survived past infancy. Court physicians recorded that she experienced chronic joint pain, breathing difficulties, and what they described as periods of deep melancholy that were likely depression caused by chronic illness and the emotional impact of repeated pregnancy losses. Margarita Theresa's health deteriorated progressively after each pregnancy, creating a cycle of reproductive challenges that ultimately led to her early passing at age 22. Court records detail increasingly intensive attempts to preserve her health between pregnancies, including extended bloodletting sessions, herbal treatments that cause severe digestive problems, and enforced bed rest that confined her to darkened rooms for months at a time. Her personal physician noted that she experienced what he called royal blood weakness, characterized by joints that swelled without apparent cause, frequent nosebleeds that were difficult to control, and wounds that healed slowly or became infected despite careful treatment. Modern hematologists analyzing these symptoms recognize clear signs of inherited bleeding disorders that were complicated by the medical treatments of the era. The psychological impact on Habsburg daughters was intensified by their complete lack of understanding about their condition. Margarita Theresa was told by court physicians that her reproductive challenges resulted from spiritual inadequacy rather than genetic factors, leading her to spend hours each day in prayer and religious practices designed to atone for imaginary moral failings. Her personal confessor recorded that she blamed herself for the loss of her children, believing that her inability to produce healthy heirs reflected some form of moral corruption. This psychological burden was systematically placed on Habsburg women who were already coping with painful genetic disorders, creating layers of emotional distress that compounded their physical challenges with crushing guilt and self-blame. The final Habsburg king of Spain, Charles II, represented the ultimate consequence of dynastic inbreeding. Born in 1661 with an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, Charles possessed genetic challenges so extensive that modern medical analysis suggests he experienced at least 2 severe genetic disorders simultaneously. Combined pituitary hormone deficiency affected his growth and development, while distal renal tubular acidosis caused kidney problems and metabolic disruption throughout his body. Contemporary accounts describe a person who could not speak clearly until age 4, could not walk independently until age 8, and never developed the cognitive capacity to rule effectively. His jaw protruded so severely that he could not chew solid food properly, requiring his meals to be prepared in liquid form. His enlarged tongue made speech nearly impossible, and his mental capacity remained limited throughout his life. Charles II's daily existence was a comprehensive example of genetic challenges that would have been considered extraordinary suffering for any individual. Court records describe a routine that revolved around managing his multiple disabilities and inherited disorders. He required assistance with basic daily activities throughout his life, including help with eating, walking, and personal care. His enlarged tongue made swallowing difficult and dangerous, leading to frequent choking episodes that concerned his attendants. His jaw deformity caused chronic discomfort and made verbal communication nearly impossible, forcing him to rely on gestures and written notes for most interactions. His cognitive limitations meant that he could not understand complex political discussions or make independent decisions about matters of state, leaving Spain effectively without strong leadership during critical periods of European conflict. The reproductive challenges of Charles II marked the inevitable biological endpoint of Habsburg inbreeding practices. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, endured a decade of marriage to a man who was physically and mentally unable to fulfill normal marital expectations. Court records hint at the difficult reality of their marriage through diplomatic references to Charles's inability to perform marital duties and Marie-Louise's melancholic disposition that developed during her years as queen. She passed away in 1689 under circumstances that court physicians attributed to sudden illness, but that modern historians suspect may have been the result of severe depression driven by the psychological challenges of her marriage situation. The medical examination performed on Charles II after his passing in 1700 revealed the full extent of genetic challenges created by centuries of inbreeding. Royal physicians recorded that his heart was severely undersized, his lungs showed signs of deterioration, his digestive system was compromised, and his brain showed abnormal fluid accumulation. His reproductive organs were so underdeveloped that he possessed only one partially formed testicle, explaining his inability to produce heirs despite 2 marriages. Modern medical historians interpreting these findings believe Charles experienced multiple genetic syndromes that would have been incompatible with normal life expectancy. Yet he survived to age 39 through careful nursing and constant medical attention. The female relatives of Charles II who survived to reproductive age faced their own genetic challenges. His sister, Margarita Teresa, passed away at 22 after giving birth to 4 children, 3 of whom did not survive infancy. His niece, Maria Antonia, daughter of Leopold I and Margarita Teresa, inherited such severe genetic challenges that she could not produce viable offspring despite multiple pregnancies. Court records describe her as experiencing continuous melancholy, weakness of the limbs, and disorders of the blood that modern analysis suggests were symptoms of inherited metabolic dysfunction. She passed away at 28 after a miscarriage that caused complications severe enough that court physicians reported she experienced massive internal bleeding. The systematic challenges faced by Habsburg daughters extended beyond Spain to the Austrian branch of the dynasty, which practiced similar marriage patterns with comparable results. Maria Anna of Austria, daughter of Ferdinand II, was married to her cousin Maximilian I of Bavaria in 1635. Their children showed clear signs of genetic challenges, including developmental delays, seizure disorders, and physical variations that court painters were instructed to minimize in official portraits. When Maria Anna passed away at 34 from what court records describe as wasting illness, her personal physician noted that she had experienced chronic infections and wounds that would not heal properly, symptoms consistent with inherited immune system deficiencies. The immune system problems that affected Habsburg women created cascading secondary health issues that often proved fatal. Maria Anna's medical records describe a progression of infections that her body could not fight effectively, beginning with minor injuries that became infected and refused to heal. Her immune deficiency progressed to the point where she could not recover from common illnesses that posed little threat to individuals with normal genetic backgrounds. Court physicians documented episodes where simple colds developed into life-threatening pneumonia, minor injuries became serious infections, and routine childbirth complications escalated to multiple organ failure as her compromised immune system proved incapable of mounting effective responses. The most genetically compromised Habsburg daughter on record was Marie Antoine of Habsburg, daughter of Emperor Leopold I and his niece Margaret of Spain. With an inbreeding coefficient of 0.3053, Marie Antoine was more genetically similar to herself than even a theoretical child of full siblings. Born in 1669, she survived only until age 8, passing away from what court physicians described as general failure of the bodily systems. Contemporary accounts suggest she never learned to walk properly, could not speak coherently, and required constant nursing care throughout her brief life. Her passing was recorded in church registries with the notation, "Called home by divine mercy," a diplomatic acknowledgement that her suffering had finally ended. Marie Antoine's case represents the extreme endpoint of what human genetics could tolerate under the pressure of systematic inbreeding. Medical records describe a child who was born with multiple organ systems that functioned so poorly that survival was remarkable even for 8 years. She experienced severe developmental delays that prevented her from reaching basic childhood milestones like walking, talking, or self-care. Her skeletal system was so compromised that she could not support her own weight, requiring specially constructed furniture and constant physical support from attendants. Her digestive system could not process normal food, forcing court physicians to develop liquid nutrition that she could consume safely. Her nervous system showed signs of severe dysfunction, including seizures that became more frequent and intense as she aged. The scientific analysis of Habsburg genealogies reveals patterns of genetic challenges that extend far beyond the most documented cases. Spanish researchers examining family trees spanning 16 generations have identified dozens of inherited conditions that appeared repeatedly in royal daughters, including epilepsy, developmental disabilities, immune system deficiencies, and reproductive difficulties. The frequency of these conditions increased dramatically with each generation as the genetic pool became increasingly restricted. By the late 17th century, Habsburg daughters were essentially guaranteed to inherit multiple genetic variations that would compromise their health, reproductive capacity, and life expectancy. Modern genetic research has identified specific chromosomal regions where Habsburg DNA shows clear signs of inbreeding effects. These genomic studies reveal that Habsburg individuals carried unusually high numbers of identical gene variants in critical biological systems, including blood clotting, immune response, bone development, and neurological function. The accumulation of these genetic variations in essential systems created the constellation of disorders that affected Habsburg daughters throughout their shortened lives. Geneticists estimate that a typical Habsburg daughter of the late 16th century carried genetic challenges equivalent to what would be seen in modern populations only in cases of severe inherited disease syndromes. The emotional impact inflicted on these women by their genetic circumstances was intensified by the complete lack of understanding about the true cause of their difficulties. Royal daughters who experienced repeated pregnancy losses, chronic pain, or developmental delays were told that their conditions resulted from moral failings, insufficient religious devotion, or divine punishment for unknown transgressions. Court physicians blamed female patients for their inability to produce healthy children, prescribing increasingly intensive and uncomfortable treatments that often worsened underlying genetic conditions. Maria Anna of Neuburg, who married Charles II in 1689, was subjected to fertility treatments that included surgical procedures performed without anesthesia, chemical compounds that caused severe reactions, and religious rituals designed to address spiritual causes believed to be preventing successful reproduction. The fertility treatments imposed on Habsburg women represent some of the most systematic medical interventions in recorded history. Court physicians, operating under the assumption that female reproductive difficulties indicated spiritual corruption, developed increasingly extreme interventions designed to force pregnancy in women whose genetic challenges made healthy reproduction nearly impossible. Maria Anna of Neuburg endured procedures that included the insertion of heated metal instruments, the application of caustic chemicals, and the consumption of mercury-based preparations that caused severe neurological effects. These treatments were performed repeatedly over months and years, causing cumulative physical trauma that compounded the genetic disorders she had inherited from her Habsburg bloodline. The religious dimension of these medical interventions added layers of psychological difficulty to the physical challenges endured by Habsburg women. Court priests and physicians worked together to convince royal patients that their genetic disorders represented divine punishment that could only be overcome through increasingly extreme forms of religious practice and medical intervention. Women who failed to produce healthy children were required to undergo public confession ceremonies, where they acknowledged their spiritual inadequacy before assembled nobles and clergy. They were forced to participate in religious rituals that included self-punishment, extended fasting, and exposure to uncomfortable conditions, all designed to purify their souls and restore their capacity for healthy reproduction. The end of the Spanish Habsburg line in 1700 marked not just a political transition, but a biological inevitability. Centuries of systematic inbreeding had created genetic challenges so extensive that the dynasty could no longer reproduce viable offspring. The War of the Spanish Succession that followed Charles II's passing was fought not just over territorial claims, but over the genetic legacy of a royal house that had essentially bred itself into extinction. French Bourbon kings who inherited the Spanish throne through female lines carried Habsburg genes, but had enough genetic diversity from other royal houses to restore reproductive viability to the Spanish monarchy. The Bourbon succession demonstrated the dramatic difference that genetic diversity could make in royal reproduction and health outcomes. Philip V, the first Bourbon king of Spain, was the great-grandson of Louis XIV and Maria Theresa of Spain, making him a carrier of Habsburg genes, but with sufficient genetic diversity to avoid the worst effects of inbreeding. His children showed none of the severe developmental delays, physical variations, or reproductive difficulties that had characterized Habsburg offspring for generations. The contrast was so striking that court physicians and foreign diplomats immediately noted the improved health and vitality of the Spanish royal family under Bourbon rule. Modern genetic analysis has confirmed what contemporary observers could only dimly perceive through the accumulation of royal tragedies. The Habsburg dynasty represents one of the most extensively documented cases of inbreeding effects in human history. University of Santiago de Compostela researchers analyzing 3,000 family members across 16 generations have calculated that Habsburg inbreeding reduced child survival rates by 17% at first-cousin marriage levels, with even more severe effects as genetic compression increased through subsequent generations. The mathematical precision of genetic analysis reveals that Habsburg daughters were not victims of mysterious illnesses or divine punishment, but casualties of deliberate breeding policies that prioritize political control over human welfare. The statistical analysis of Habsburg mortality rates reveals patterns that would be considered unacceptable if applied to modern animal breeding programs. Professional dog breeders who produced offspring with the level of genetic challenges routinely seen in Habsburg children would face serious professional consequences. Yet these same breeding practices were not only tolerated but actively encouraged when applied to human beings whose only fault was being born into royal families obsessed with maintaining bloodline purity. The contrast between modern ethical standards for animal breeding and historical practices in royal human breeding highlights the fundamental moral problems with dynastic marriage policies. The Habsburg daughters who experienced genetic challenges and shortened lifespans were not anomalies or exceptions, but inevitable products of a system that treated human beings as breeding stock for political purposes. Their stories, preserved beneath centuries of diplomatic court records and careful language, reveal the true cost of dynastic ambition measured in lost children, chronic suffering, and lives cut short by genetic complications. The portraits that survive show us their faces, often beautiful despite their physical variations, but cannot convey the reality of bodies compromised by their own DNA and systems that valued bloodline purity over basic human survival. Every Habsburg daughter who passed away before her 20th birthday, every royal woman who endured difficult pregnancies and chronic illness, every child born with genetic challenges so severe that survival was impossible represents a human cost that was entirely preventable. The genetic science that could have warned against these marriages did not exist in the 16th century, but the observable consequences of inbreeding were clear to anyone willing to acknowledge them. Court physicians recorded the patterns of illness and early mortality. Church officials documented the high rates of infant loss, and foreign ambassadors commented on the physical variations increasingly common among Habsburg royalty. The willful denial of Habsburg rulers regarding the consequences of their marriage policies represents one of history's most tragic examples of institutional blindness in the face of overwhelming evidence. Generation after generation of sickly children, reproductive difficulties, and premature deaths failed to convince Habsburg kings and their advisors that their breeding practices were fundamentally flawed. Instead of acknowledging the obvious connection between family intermarriage and genetic challenges, court officials developed increasingly elaborate explanations that blamed everything except the true cause. They attributed infant mortality to divine punishment, reproductive difficulties to female moral inadequacy, and physical variations to astrological influences, all while continuing to arrange marriages between close relatives that guaranteed the continuation of genetic problems. The systematic inbreeding of royal daughters in the 1500s stands as one of history's most extensively documented examples of institutionalized genetic manipulation disguised as political strategy. These women, born into the highest ranks of European society, possessed wealth, power, and privilege beyond the imagination of their subjects. Yet they were condemned by their own bloodlines to lives of difficulty that often ended in premature death. Their stories serve as a stark reminder that no amount of political power or divine claims can overcome the basic biological requirements for human health and survival. The legacy of Habsburg genetic challenges extends far beyond the individual royal daughters. The systematic inbreeding practices that characterized European royal houses for centuries created cultural precedents that normalized genetic manipulation for political purposes. These practices established the dangerous principle that human reproductive choices could be subordinated to political calculations, regardless of the consequences for the individuals involved. The same logic that justified forcing Habsburg daughters into genetically problematic marriages would later be used to justify forced sterilization programs, racial purity laws, and other forms of reproductive control that troubled the 20th century. The Habsburg dynasty's collapse represents more than just the end of a royal house. It demonstrates the ultimate futility of attempting to control human genetics through political marriages and religious dispensations. The daughters who paid the price for their family's ambitions deserve to be remembered not as footnotes in political histories, but as human beings whose suffering revealed fundamental truths about genetics, power, and the dangerous consequences of treating people as instruments of policy rather than individuals worthy of protection and care. As we close this examination of systematic genetic manipulation disguised as royal privilege, we are left with the sobering recognition that the challenges experienced by Habsburg daughters were entirely preventable consequences caused by human choices rather than natural disasters. Their experiences serve as an enduring warning about the dangers of valuing political power over human welfare, and their memory demands that we never forget the individual costs of institutional decisions, no matter how elaborately they may be disguised as tradition, necessity, or divine will. The royal daughters of the 1500s paid the ultimate price for their family's genetic policies, and their sacrifice should never be forgotten or repeated.